Thank you again, everybody, for coming and for joining us for the launch of Oneness World's new YouTube channel, Democracy Tomorrow, and for joining our roundtable discussion today on world citizenship in a fragmenting world. Beyond our shared interest in world citizenship, I believe we also deeply agree that our world is deteriorating faster and more deeply than it is progressing. Put simply, it could and should be so much better. And it is in this quest for a better world that we meet tonight. Setting the scene in the context of the era we're all living through is widely enough known by all of us to feel that I feel no need to do so. We all know where we find ourselves today on our shared planet. What I do wish to do, however, through this meeting and through our channel, Democracy Tomorrow, is to begin to breathe new life into the ancient idea of world citizenship, an idea we all know has been around for more than 2,000 years. As bad as things may appear on the political front, and indeed they are almost bad in too many ways and far worse than anyone even realizes, we need to use the negative, nationalistic, hate-filled energy that is so dominant these days, not as a source of despair, but as a source of energy to put forward an infinitely more positive vision, not based on division, not based on fear of the other, but a vision grounded in our shared humanity, no matter where we were born or where we may live. We need to breathe new life into the UN Charter and imagine what a charter based on world citizenship, rather than exclusively nation states, might look like. We need to generate new sources of wind in the sails of the never more relevant Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the human rights treaties that were constructed on its foundations and bring them into reality more than ever before. We have the numbers. The power of the people, all 8 billion of us, far exceeds the power of despots, dictators, billionaires, and nationalists, big and small. We the people beats me the people anytime and every time. If the people in large enough numbers embrace and expand this vision of a world organized around the shared citizenship of all of us on a single planet on which everyone depends, then this is what the world will become. To put it simply and personally, my commitment to world citizenship means, among other things, that I want my citizenship to be the same as yours, whoever and wherever you may be. I want all of us to share the same passports, enjoy the same rights and legal protections. I believe there are hundreds of millions who share this view, perhaps even far more than that. People who see each other first as fellow humans, of equal value, to whom equal respect and compassion is afforded. We simply need a place to gather, a shared message, and then a movement that will simply be unstoppable. This is just common sense. The days of division must end today. A better world awaits us all if we come together and make world citizenship a reality. Today, we are delighted to have all of you here to share your views on world citizenship and where we can go from here to raise the profile of this goal to levels greater than ever before. With that, I would like to invite Canadian diplomat Diego Osorio to offer his views. Diego was asked, what are the main obstacles to world citizenship? Diego, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and thank you to all of you, and very honored to be in such a high level company, and thanks for the for the question. I would just say that the main political obstacles, in my opinion, to world citizenship are not just institutional, they're existential. But whether we're looking at diplomacy, peace building, climate security, any other area that connects international governance, there seem to be three key political barriers to world citizenship. And these three stand out, whether we're looking at the situation in Latin America, the Andes, Southeast Asia, or any other part of the world. First, the architecture of international law and governance is fundamentally state-centric. We have a UN system, an international system where sovereignty is sacrosanct, but human dignity is conditional. And that's a very strange situation. As long as citizenship is defined by nationality rather than by rights and participation, world citizenship will remain an aspiration instead of a status. That's the first thing that I see here. Second, And this is very much connected to the reality that we're facing in different parts of the planet, including my country, but also the one below the 49th parallel, is we are seeing a dangerous convergence between populism and planetary breakdown. As climate-induced displacement increases and global inequality deepens, nationalist responses are hardening. And I have seen firsthand in contexts where the fear of the other is politically weaponized, whether that other is a refugee, an indigenous land defender, an immigrant, or a climate scientist. And this happens in many ways, soft ways, hard ways. Obviously, the political climate in Canada doesn't compare to the one in the US today, but people use the other as a way of scoring cheat points, or they use the other as a way of a sounding board for testing what will be the next level of the political discourse. That's extremely worrying. Third, we lack institutions capable of holding complexity. And complexity is a very important word for me because I work on complexity science. But that complexity relates to different angles. For instance, when we talk about the climate security nexus, it is a perfect example of that situation, climate security. And so there are many people involved. But it's a topic that cuts across borders, sectors, and timelines. Yet our political system is still thinking in silos. Foreign policy here, environment there, peace building over there. The result is an ultimate paralysis, or worse, fragmented action that reproduces inequity. And that I've seen it in everyday I do. So what can we do? Well, I believe we need to pivot from governance for citizens to governance with citizens. That means engaging not just national governments, but also local authorities, transnational networks, indigenous communities, and yes, even those historically left out of the decision making. And I use an example that is not mine. It comes from Professor Mark Lago, the one who coined that concept of homeland dignity and global governance, very close to Mr. Augusto López-Claros' thesis as well, which is the idea that basically we could look at things such as the ILO, in which it's not just the state, it's citizens, different angles. We can triangulate, or we can increase the level of representation. That's one thing. It also means anchoring this governance in human dignity, not as a slogan. We all tend to agree what human dignity is, but it's more difficult to define it precisely. So not as a slogan, but as a design principle. Dignity is the only viable common denominator across fractured identities, political systems, and belief frameworks. Mr. Lago puts it this way, and I very much second what he says: dignity is what allows to hold rights and responsibilities in tension and in community. And third, I would say we must be willing to experiment institutionally, adaptive complexity. Whether through global citizens' assemblies, climate compacts, or bioregional treaties, the future of citizenship will be co-created. Being linear and static is not the way to carry on with governance for the 21st century. That co-creation needs to be grounded in both ecological interdependence and political courage. So I will just finish by saying that I heard this somewhere, I don't recall exactly where, but we might not be one people yet, but we do share one future. And world citizenship is not about erasing differences. It's about designing institutions and ethics that can hold it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Diego. Excellent as always. And since the country below the 49th parallel was mentioned, I do need to remind everybody that, much to our surprise, perhaps, in 1945, when the UN Charter was being drafted in San Francisco, which will turn 80 years old, by the way, on the 26th of June, very soon, 6 of the 48 American states voted to join a world government comprised of world citizens if that was the outcome of the UN Charter discussions. So somehow I think the vote would look a little bit different today. But at any rate, thank you very much, Diego. The next speaker will be Augusto López-Claros, who is, among many other things, the chair of the Global Governance Forum. So I'm very happy to give the floor to you, Augusto.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you as well to Diego for his very thoughtful remarks. I want to begin in a kind of an unusual place. We all have come to the concept of world citizenship from different perspectives and different angles. And I want to share with you at the outset a kind of very transformative experience I had when I was in my teens. I came into contact with a letter that was written in 1906 by a gentleman who at that time was the head of the Baha'i community. He was a prisoner in what today is the State of Israel, but back then it was Palestine, part of the Turkish Empire. And this was a letter that he wrote to a lady in Scotland by the name of Jane Elizabeth White, who was the wife of a clergyman in Edinburgh. And she was, fervent admirer of the Baha'i teachings. And he wrote to her because he expected to visit Edinburgh in the next few years, and she was going to help organize some events and meetings there. And in this letter, he introduces the concept of unity, and in particular, the concept of unity of nations. And he says it is a concept which will cause, and I quote, all the peoples of the world to regard themselves as citizens of one common fatherland. And then he further elaborates and he puts actually a time frame on the emergence of this concept of global citizenship. And he says that it would be securely established in the 20th century. Okay, so I want to just give you four arguments as to why I think this concept of global citizenship is in fact already a reality on the ground. As surprising as you may find that, but bear with me for a few minutes, and if I don't persuade you, well, we can come back during the Q&A. Obviously, Scott has already referred to the UN Charter. For me, the UN Charter is a very important moment in the development of the concept of global citizenship. The Charter refers to faith and fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women of all nations, large and small. The founders of the UN declared their intention, and I quote, to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, to unite in our strength to maintain international peace and security, and employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples, and so on. You are all familiar with the Charter. Yes, it was adopted by 51 nations in 1945, but by the end of the 20th century, there were 189 members, accounting for 99.7% of the world's population. Today, the UN has 193 members. Of course, one can debate whether the members of the United Nations have abided by all the principles they endorsed when joining, and you can make a strong case that many of them have not as we speak. But for me, there is little doubt that the UN Charter represents a kind of a unique moment in human history, when, against the background of the calamity and the killing and the maiming and destruction of World War II, we rose above our differences and we made a lasting statement about our common humanity and resolved to come together to create a better, more peaceful world. So that's one argument. Second argument, and I think that Scott already made reference to this, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? This document declares all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. The declaration, which was actually a General Assembly resolution, was endorsed by 48 of the 58 member states. Not a single country voted against it. And as you know, the declaration contributed to strengthen the legal framework underpinning the observance of human rights at the global level. And if you actually go article by article, it basically covers, and it's an extremely ambitious document. It talks about the will of the people as the basis of government authority. It talks about equal rights, rights to equal protection under the law, the availability of information and freedom of association, the right to the ownership of property, and so on. It is against the background of the UN Charter, also a very, very important document. Of course, many countries have fallen short of implementing their obligations under the declaration. But from my mind, there is little doubt that this document also represents a profound affirmation of our common heritage and the links that binds us together across national borders. So that's the second argument. My third argument is a little bit sort of more creative, so to speak, and it comes from anthropology, or what I would regard as insights from anthropology. Many people argue that the diversity of the human family is an argument against the notion of global citizenship. We're just too diverse, speak different languages, have different ethnicities, different religious systems, and so on. In fact, I think it was a former Prime Minister, Theresa May, who in 2016 said, if you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere. Apparently, in her mind, it's the identification with local values and that are the defining mark of citizenship, right? But one of my favorite anthropologists, George Murdoch, who was the chair of the anthropology department at Yale University for a quarter century, he made a very interesting observation. He said that if you look at different cultures, regardless of location, I mean, you can look at the Quechua and the Incas in the Andes and Korean native culture, you will find that these cultures have a great deal of things in common. They share things in common. And then, in fact, in a very celebrated long paragraph, he made a list of something like 50 features, which I will not read because we don't have the time, that these cultures share universally, from athletic sports to bodily adornment, to calendar, to courtship, to education, to family, feasting, funeral rites, games, mourning, music, marriage, etc., 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 right? And he goes on to say that although behaviors across cultures will differ, in some countries, people eat rice with chopsticks, and others they eat with forks. He says all cultures are constructed according to a single fundamental plan, the universal cultural pattern, a concept based on the psychic unity of mankind. So for me, this is a very, very powerful argument, and it is based on scientific observation. It is an argument that comes from anthropology. And then my final argument, this is a more recent argument. This is what I would call the mapping, the insights that come from the mapping of the human genome. This is something that was achieved by two groups of scientists working in the UK and in the US. And it was the subject of a big press conference between Bill Clinton and Tony Blair at the end of 2000. In which they decided to jointly announce that this competition had actually been a tie, right? The head of the American team, a very brilliant scientist by the name of Craig Ventier, made a very interesting statement in the media afterwards. He said that one of the first things we wanted to understand in the context of this mapping was the concept of race. Does race have a scientific underpinning, or is it instead a cultural concept? And he said that we decided to do an experiment. We took two individuals that come from two radically different cultures. Think of it as Swedish blonde-haired, blue-eyed male and an African curly-haired, dark-skinned Nigerian. And we ask ourselves, what percent of the genes that these two individuals have do you actually need to explain the differences on the basis of which we say they come from two different races? And he said, to our surprise, we discovered that you needed 0.01% of the gene pool. In other words, these two individuals have 99.99% exactly the same genetic endowment. And therefore, he said, we concluded that there is only one race, the human race. And so to me, this is, if we need any scientific evidence that in fact we're one human family, notwithstanding our cultural differences and other differences of belief, of color of skin and so on, this is it. To me, this is the truth. Now, obviously, you might say, but look at the world, look at the conflict, look at the division, look at sort of rising violence and the renewed arms race and so on and so forth, right? And my answer to this is yes, there is a gap between the reality as established in science, such as the mapping of the human genome, and our understanding of that reality, right? And I think that it will be through processes of education and enlightenment that in coming decades, that gap will be narrowed. And as that gap is narrowed, that we will internalize, beginning with our children and then, emerging generations, this concept of our common citizenship. We are members of one human family. We are, as that gentleman who wrote the letter to Jane Elizabeth White said, the earth is but one country and mankind its citizen, right? Now, can this concept be embedded in a new vision of the UN Charter? Yes, absolutely, of course. Our second charter, which was published last September and which you can see on the website of the Global Governance Forum, already incorporates in it implicitly this concept of our common humanity, our single heritage. We are citizens of one world, living in one planet, our common Earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Augusto. Well said, as always. And, it's so important to reiterate all of those foundations for the dream that we are all seeking, and to keep reminding ourselves of these basic fundamental scientific facts, legal facts, physiological facts. All of these facts point in the direction of the objective that we seek, and yet for some reason it doesn't occur. And I think that's really where we need to put a lot of our minds next. And fortunately, the next two speakers are dealing with a really fundamental question, which is, what are the psychological obstacles, in effect, that are stopping more people from embracing their fellow humans and trying to build a system which benefits everyone instead of just a few. And as Pablo and I always say when we have discussions regularly, and others as well, there's really no other way to imagine a planet that we want to see surviving unless there's infinitely more unity amongst people than there is today. A system built on cooperation instead of competition, a system that's actually capable of addressing climate change and other threats, and so on. So thank you again, Augusto. The next speaker is Nigel Denning, who's the Managing Director of Integrative Psychology and Medicine in nearby Melbourne. And his question is, what are the psychological obstacles to embracing world citizenship, and how can these be overcome? Nigel, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I mean, the obstacle towards world citizenship, I think, lies in our brain, lies in our mind, and it lies in how we understand it. So we're in a position in history now where we've got a mental health crisis in the midst of the richest society that's ever existed. We've got extraordinary opportunities. We've got extraordinary freedoms at one level, yet our mental health is extraordinarily poor. Australian Bureau of Statistics outcome demonstrates that something like almost 1 in 2 adults will receive a mental health diagnosis in their lifetime. We've got anxiety, we've got depression, we've got rising ADHD, autism spectrum diagnoses. In any given year, more than 20% of the population will receive a diagnosis. And what we're particularly good at is identifying these negative states, treating these negative states, and pathologizing the population. What it leads to is fragmentation. What it leads to is alienation. What it leads to is everyone carrying particular mental health labels, often being medically treated for them. But people aren't really asking what it is about a rich society that is creating this problem for us, that's creating these mental health issues. Is that it can't simply be individuals. It can't simply be the problem of the biology of an individual just randomly mutating. So we have to look at what it is about our society that's creating these impediments. We don't have anything like a common agreement on what a human mind is. We've got over 500 different psychological therapies out there. Those psychological therapies are targeted, they're evidence-based, but they often don't agree on what it is that they're dealing with. We have no common definition of a human mind. And we have even less understanding at an agreed clinical level of the relationship between a mind and a brain. So what we have is this kind of this sort of fragmented approach to the mind. And what we're looking at in a human mind is something that is grown out of an evolutionary process. So all of us inside our skulls have processes that have their evolutionary roots 300 million years ago. We have a threat response system that's been on this planet for a hell of a long time, doing a pretty good job of simply keeping organisms alive. We have a 200 million year old operating system that's about social grouping. Our evolutionary survival has come about because we're able to group together as a species. We've got a cortex that's barely 1 million years old, and civilization is about 14,000 years old. So we've been practicing this gig of being human for a tiny fragment of the time that we've been in evolutionary movement. And each individual grows up in this sort of same evolutionary pattern. We're born with senses, we're born deaf, dumb, blind, essentially. And all of these processes come online through relationship with others. So babies learn to see, they learn to smell, they learn to touch, they then become emotionally engaged and they become part of the group. They then enter into this symbolic order. They then enter into the world of language, and embedded in the world of language that children are born into are all these assumptions, all of these histories, all of these traumas, all of these stories. Nothing in our understanding of psychology is really helping us understand the interaction between the individual and the society around them. And so what we end up doing is organising our society in incredibly primitive ways. We're dominated by power and control dynamics, where the alpha male is typically an organising principle. We work on fear, and so we stimulate this really, really primitive part of our brain, which sends us simply into survival mode. Our capacity to occupy our medial prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain, our emoting brain, our affective brain, is limited by the degree of fear that we experience. So we have social systems that stimulate fear. We have social systems where leadership becomes the acquisition of power, the acquisition of wealth, the acquisition of control, which is all driven by very, very primitive aspects of our biological and evolutionary drives. We are not understanding the potential of the human brain. We're not using psychology to understand how we optimize, how we provide support, how we create conditions and societies where empathy and engagement are privileged. If we were to take the view that every brain born on this planet has an extraordinary potential, and we set the conditions to optimize that potential, then our brain, and we know this, when we remove threat from the system, when we remove fear from the system, what we get is an optimization. We get interconnectivity. That's a higher metacognitive view. That's where the mind organizes when it isn't threatened, when it isn't faced with power and control dynamics. So I guess the point I just want to make is that world citizenship is a natural progression of a mind freed of threat, a mind freed of competition, a mind freed of fear. There's an evolutionary kind of process. There's a psychological process whereby we move to that affiliative level, that we move to that interpersonal, empathetic, interconnected place by removing the stimulus for these more primitive parts of the brain. So I guess what I'd like to just say to conclude is that if we took that view that we have, that psychology provides us with an understanding and a set of conditions to optimize people's capacity, then we would create a world where citizenship is an inevitable part of the process. As Augusto said quite eloquently, we're 99.9% the same. All of these differences are delusions created by fear, created by power, created by control, and created by lower evolutionary parts of our mind brain.
Great. Thank you very much, Nigel. And that, that phrase, removing threat and fear from the system, is so valid, particularly today, obviously, in the political climate of the world in which we live, where those two features are dominant in seeking votes that are based upon the non-existent but feels real other. And those who use those arguments obviously are getting away with it. And it even exists in happy little Australia, where we're right in the middle of an election campaign, and no one in the whole world knows that that's actually happening, because we actually do it in a very low-key kind of way. Only lasts 5 weeks, but we've already noticed threat and fear being used by certain political parties. Well, actually several, who are trying to win votes along those lines. So I think strategically down the road, all of us need to think about how to structurally remove those things from the political sphere, and try to come up with means of tackling that and taking away the causes of threat and the causes of fear. And obviously a lot of that would simply have to do with creating greater equality and less deprivation, which in turn would leave people much less likely to use fear as the basis for their vote, rather than embracing the similarities that we all share. And the similarity, as Augusto said and others have already said, the similarity at the most basic level, the things that we all share are so much infinitely greater in number than the things we don't. And the things that we don't, that largely cultural differences, are what make life worth living. So we really need to get back on that track. And which brings us to the next speaker, my friend Bandy Lee, who is very interested in the topic of world citizenship and a number of other things. Many of you have probably already seen her on television or heard her on podcasts. She's been on the Midas Touch Network countless times, and CNN and elsewhere. And she's probably, of all of her achievements, probably most well known for her book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, where she was one of the first psychologists to analyze the mental state of the current president of the United States. And the question we asked her to address is the role of mental health in a world of world citizens. Should aspiring politicians be required to maintain a threshold of mental and psychological health in order to be eligible for election? So Bandy, the floor goes to you. Thanks again, Nigel.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Nigel, for a great segue. Well, as a social psychiatrist, I've focused very much on structure, so I feel very much at home here. To be able to navigate and to salvage our survival in our time, I say that we have to understand that we are in a psychological age, That is the emphasis on the mind that you have mentioned. And that is, only our ability to master our own minds will save humankind from mutual assured destruction by whatever means we may use. To understand how we have arrived at this death spiral, we must understand the interplay between the structures we have set up and their psychological consequences. And many of those structures have to do with nation states, as Scott and I have discussed. When the drive for suicide afflicts an entire species and pushes it toward extinction, we may call this tendency collective suicidality, as I have in my textbook Violence, which was published conceived many years before Donald Trump came about. Socially, politically, and economically structuring the world as we have, so as to maximize structural violence. And structural violence is a phrase coined by the great Norwegian sociologist Johan Galtung to indicate inequalities that deprive vast populations of basic needs. This has given rise to psychologically unfit leaders who subsequently accelerate our drive towards self-annihilation. Structural violence aligns with individuals who seek positions of leadership for their power and influence, rather than their capacity to serve society. So over time, personal ambition eclipses any sense of collective responsibility as a motivator for pursuing leadership, such that quality of leadership deteriorates. That is in a competitive, unequal society. Positions of power are increasingly seen as compensatory entitlement for the purpose of assuaging feelings of powerlessness and inadequacy, rather than a duty. This perceived purpose is especially compelling for those who are psychologically impaired, making leadership roles disproportionately attractive to those who need to assert dominance. This compulsive self-selection process overrides existing mechanisms for screening or accountability, leading to the emergence of unfit so-called leaders who are cunning, manipulative, and ruthless, willing to do anything to rise to the top. Unfit leaders, by definition, lack the qualities necessary for good governance, such as empathy, problem-solving abilities, or genuine commitment to the public, but may excel at exploiting the existing power structures to advance themselves and to defeat political opponents. They are likely to respond to criticisms with defensiveness while manipulating societal divisions to maintain their status and control. Their us versus them mentality reinforces rather than addresses the systemic inequalities that allowed their rise in the first place. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few in this manner may lead to the rise of leaders who use their positions merely to consolidate power. These so-called leaders frequently employ populist rhetoric to rally support and to justify their authority with little to back up their claims or promises. When they run out of ways to buttress their unwarranted power, they often resort to demonizing outgroups or to fragmenting external or framing external enemies as the cause of their hardship. And this, of course, fragments society. Such leaders thus stoke ethnic tensions, fears, and divisions to maintain their control within society, using their dominance to suppress dissent and to stifle opposition, rather than to improve conditions. Democratic institutions are the greatest quote-unquote obstacles for unfit heads of state, which leads them to undermine and to erode the rule of law, creating environments where inefficiency, corruption, and abuse of power thrive, which in turn leads to greater societal division and dysfunction. In this context, the rise of unfit leaders is not merely a political issue, but a structural one arising from profound psychological pathologies. A psychological consequence of this incompetent governance is trauma, particularly for those already disenfranchised, leading to widespread disaffection and alienation. Ineffective leadership commonly leads to economic mismanagement and social unrest and violations of human rights, all of which contribute to the suffering of the population. Psychological afflictions arising from trauma can have long-term consequences, leading to cycles of abuse, violence, and the subsequent veneration and pursuit of power. The deprivation of basic needs, such as education, healthcare, food, shelter, and security, creates a cycle of disillusionment and discontent, which may erupt in interpersonal violence or collective uprisings. That is partly why I have emphasized throughout my career that structural violence is the most potent stimulant of behavioral violence. Poor governance also erodes general trust in institutions and leaders, making it more difficult for citizens to engage in meaningful collective action for change. The consequence of emotional and psychological harm from poor governance are not limited to the local and national level, but has global implications as well. Refugees fleeing from war, violence, or political persecution contribute to the collective experience of trauma, reinforcing fears and divisions among countries and complicating efforts to foster global cohesion. In this context, the failure of governance at the nation-state level can have ripple effects that reverberate throughout the globe, especially when the failure is occurring in a hegemonic nation-state, such as the US. The trauma generated by incompetent governance creates conditions in which more unfit leaders are likely to rise to power. As the political and public discontent grows with existing leadership, they become increasingly vulnerable to populist rhetoric or authoritarian promises for stability, which inevitably fail to address the root causes of societal problems and may even exploit the popularity of populism to further entrench control. This cycle of governance and unfit leadership has led to our current death spiral, as social, political, and economic conditions continue to deteriorate. The appearance of unfit leaders who exploit the same systems of inequality and oppression that led to their rise in the first place only deepens the cycle of fragmentation and conflict. These leaders often prioritize personal or national gain over global cooperation, further isolating their nations from the international community. As a result, global oneness becomes increasingly difficult to achieve as divisions between nations grow wider and more entrenched. There is one way that global citizenship can halt this trend and prevent the spread of unfit leaders. Implementing standards, such as basic mental fitness evaluations, would keep out the 10% of disordered leaders who are responsible for 99% of global atrocities, calamities, and extinction dangers. In summary, structural violence and inequality shape social and political landscapes in ways that affect leadership dynamics. Environments where power and resources are distributed unequally, such as through a global capitalist system, foster the emergence of unfit leaders. This structure becomes a magnet for attracting power-seeking individuals, generating trauma through poor governance, and creating the vicious cycle of leadership dysfunction. This is a current dynamic that is making human beings the first species in planetary history to bring about our own extinction. A dynamic we must understand to bring ourselves closer to global oneness and collective survival. And that is the psychological dynamic I'm speaking of. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Bandy. It's so true. And to put it at a basic level, you know, it takes a doctor in most countries 10, 15, 25 years of study to become a doctor. It takes almost every profession that has some sort of competence that can help or seriously harm people in society a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades of training before they're officially recognized as capable of holding that position. There are no similar tests when it comes to politicians. The only criteria, generally speaking, is age, and occasionally whether they've committed a serious felony or another crime. Actually, Pablo and I came up with 10 criteria that we thought would be necessary to have a better set of leaders in the world, that we put in our book. And it's everything from never having been convicted of a crime to providing tax returns for 10 years and disclosing all beneficial interests in business, signing a pledge of good governance, never having served in the armed forces, no familial relationship with other political leaders from the same country, and a net worth of less than $20 million, among other things. So just trying to get that out there, that we really need to start applying criteria to politicians as well. It shouldn't be a free to do anything zone as it has become, and with obvious consequences. And depending on how you define autocracy or dictatorship or authoritarian these days, the numbers are in the many dozen that run countries. And it reminds me of something that Reed said many, many years ago, famously repeated under his title as the dictator hunter, which he doesn't like anymore, but that is what a lot of people still call him, having been the lead lawyer in the first major legal bring down of a dictator in the case of his son Giscard Habre in Chad. He said, if you kill one person in New York City, you'll go to jail and stay in Rikers for the rest of your life. I don't remember the exact number he used, but he said, if you kill 50,000 people in whatever, Burkina Faso, you'll get a nice asylum in Saudi Arabia, something like that. But that remains as true today as ever. And if we look at the series of crimes that are perpetuated by leaders in power on this day, the 15th of April, 2025, and how many of them will ever face any sort of justice for those crimes, we all know, unfortunately, that the numbers are, very low. So, well, thank you, Bandy, for all of the work that you've done and all the work that you're going to do with your new initiative that we can talk about again soon. And as always, thanks so much for being here. Straight to you, Richard Falk, I will tell you, Richard, even though I've never met you, we have about 1,001 friends that are the same. And your book, I think it was called Human Rights and Sovereignty. I think it was from 1983. It has a brown cover. It's pretty much the first human rights book that I ever read. So thank you for that. And thank you for the subsequent 40 years that I've been a human rights guy. Your question is, what changes would be needed in international law to create a legal status of world citizenship?
I thank you, Scott, and others for a very profound set of presentations. I feel I've learned a lot and have a lot to learn in combining this deeper understanding both of the aspirations for world citizenship and the obstacles to attaining it. And I think you have to think about both sides of that problematic nexus to understand why the collective experience of humans has deteriorated under the impact of this accelerating fragmentation and inequality. It's not accidental in a way that we confront an extinction crisis, which also has its ecological foundations in limits to how we can manipulate power that have been exposed by the climate change threats, which are not of human origin, but reinforce this kind of threat-dominated, fear-oriented system of responses. And in that sense, I feel that the question put to me is, in a sense, premature, because without a sense of community as an existential reality, citizenship isn't very meaningful. And the whole illusion of community at the global level has been exposed in the period in which the UN has basically failed to live up to its own charter. And if one wants to put a more charitable way of explaining this reality, it is that the UN was designed by the winners of World War II to preserve their dominance over the global system. And it is expressed by the ambivalence toward power. On the one side, a framework of potential law and cooperation, but on another side, a designed primacy of what I call geopolitics. And the epitome of this is giving the most dangerous countries in the world, the most powerful ones, the right of veto, which in effect is a invitation to pursue strategic interests when they clash with law or morality. And these 5 states that were the winners in World War II designed this hybrid system that looks as though it's interested in war prevention and global security and human rights and development for all, but in practice has nurtured a reality that is characterized by the greatest degree of inequality and the highest level of threat perception in all of human history. I feel one has to acknowledge this hybridity that is at the core of the kinds of normative steps forward that Augusto mentioned a half hour or so ago. And I would add that citizenship follows from a sense of belonging. It's an existential reality, or it doesn't have much substantive hold on either imagination or behavior. So how does one nurture that sense of belonging to a species, to a normative structure that values justice more than law and more than, see, law can be used as an instrument of power. The colonial countries legitimized their dominance and exploitation of the weak by privileging their own civilizational development of a legal pattern of essentially the justifications for the exploitation and dominance. So that who manages the legal order shapes its benevolence or its malevolence. It's capable of both accentuating inequality and facilitating liberation and equality, liberation from these structures of exploitation and dominance and inequality that has resulted, as Bandy Lee pointed out, in part by the way in which capitalism has been made into a predatory system of generating wealth and income. And it's that predatory characteristic that continues to punish the poor and vulnerable and reward the rich and powerful. And so there's a political agenda, what I think I'm trying to express, that has to precede the development of the potential of law to promote justice. And although normative declarations are extremely important in fertilizing the imagination, they do not get us to a different posture of political and economic and cultural reality. And how do we manage to evoke this sense of belonging without accentuating the tendency toward fear? One of Australia's most charismatic peace activists, Helen Caldicott, dwelled on fear as the foundation of rationality in the face of the threat of nuclear weapons. Those that didn't want that message tried to dismiss her as saying that she was hysterical and a fear-monger, whereas she was dedicated to peace, cooperation, and to the ideals of world citizenship. So again, these underlying variables can be manipulated in a way that accentuates the extinction crisis or transcends it. And I think that duality of the underlying conditions is what poses most clearly the challenge of achieving world citizenship rather than affirming it. And I think that emphasis on what people who've worked with some of these issues from the perspective of a world order call the transition problem. How does one structure and promote transition to this more benign arrangement of power, influence, and belonging that are so absent from the present reality? And I feel that discussions such as this one is a very important stepping stone toward overcoming this widespread misunderstanding of, for instance, the movement for world government or world citizenship, which is often dismissed as utopian and irrelevant to problem solving. And again, Bandy Lee spoke about the mental unfitness of the current crop of leaders to engage in problem solving dedicated to the public good rather than for purposes of personal and private gain. And we have that kind of system that we're trying to survive in. And that's what, in my view, makes this time this historical period, such a challenging one, which does pose threats and for which fear is a reasonable response. It's not only a way of manipulating power, it's also a way of interpreting the dangers of the current configurations of power. And so what I would try to say, and I've really put aside what I had prepared to say because of a desire to respond in a more organic way to what others preceding me have said, is that it's somewhat premature to think of this as a legal issue, that or at the very least, one has to couple law with politics on one side and ethics on the other side. That to think of law as an abstraction is partly to make it irrelevant, or even worse, to make it an instrument for these unfit power wielders that are creating this intolerable set of social, cultural, and political conditions. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was ultra insightful as always. I don't even know where to begin to comment on that, other than to say, I talk about world citizenship wherever I go, and I have for many, many decades. And if I was to add up all the conversations I've had with those thousands upon thousands of people in every region of the world, there's one response which far outnumbers all others. And that is simply, this will never happen until aliens visit Earth. That's always the response. It doesn't matter if they're Latinos or Africans or Asians or North Americans or Europeans. So frequently, probably 80 to 90% of the responses are that. So obviously, as far as we know, that's not happening anytime soon. So we do need, though, to gauge our actions upon where people are ready to embrace them. We need to meet them where they are ready to meet us, those who are not yet ready to embrace the concept. So we suggest, make climate change the de facto alien then, something that affects all of us everywhere. It's just a question of scale, timing, and degree, or other factors, international peace and security, things of that nature. And I think at the same time, globalization, international law generally, the Charter, they all had potential to push us closer to a world of world citizenship. But each one in their own ways, as we all know, failed. And we need to, be cognizant of why those failed. And structural ones, political ones, economic ones, inequality ones, things of that nature. And really focus exactly on what you said, the transition problem. And to try to help people to see, how would it benefit me if I was a world citizen, or if we lived in a world of world citizens instead of 193 nation states? How would it physically benefit my life and my family's life and my community's life? And we need to have convincing answers to that. in this world of extreme inequality where 70+% of the population of our planet lives essentially with no savings and paycheck to paycheck. And we also need to give positive examples. The European Union, for all of its flaws and all of its deep difficulties in so many respects, nonetheless, is a remarkable institution that has somehow brought together nations, 27 nations that have generally been enemies throughout their recorded history, all giving them essentially the same passports and the same rights. And other many examples existed at smaller regional levels across the world. And we need to think of what would it actually look like down the road, and put, as you said, we may be putting the horse before the cart and things like the cart before the horse. But we do also need to offer what it would actually look like, because when we talk more about citizenship, and we could have countless years of discussions about this, what does citizenship actually mean in a world where you can now quite literally buy citizenship from more than 25 countries? So thank you again very much, Richard. It's a great honor to be with you and to meet you finally after knowing about you for so long. And thank you for that book, Human Rights and Sovereignty. I think that's what Human Rights and State Sovereignty. I still have it. So thank you again for your entire career, in fact, and for all the contributions you've made to international law and being the face of reason from the country from which you are speaking. Something that is unfortunately in short supply now, viewed from the outside. We will have Pablo Rueda speak to us, and his question. He's a regulatory and transactional lawyer with over 25 years of experience. He's originally Argentine. His question is world citizenship truly inevitable? What can be done to speed this up in a world that seems to be going in the opposite direction? So, Pablo?
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for the invitation. I am honored to share this panel with such distinguished speakers with much more expertise than me, that I'm only a corporate lawyer. I was a politician at the time of my university studies, and because of Bandy's description of politicians were very similar to those I shared in my university times, so I preferred to switch to corporate law. Okay, what I feel about the situation today with inequality is that we are in a situation that is very similar to that of Europe at the end of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution created with market forces an enormous wealth that was unequally allocated to a few, and leaving the rest that worked a lot in that process without any benefits of that revolution. And what happened because of that was what Marx predicted, that revolution was going to be followed by another revolution that was going to result in the proletarian dictatorship and communism. And the prediction was right. What Marx did not anticipate is that the rich few were going to decide to surrender part of their wealth and the wealth of their heirs to construct a social welfare system in Europe that would allow fairly to include in the benefits of the Industrial Revolution the rest. And I think that today we are in a similar situation because we had a real technological revolution productivity has changed enormously because of technology and will continue. And that revolution has also created an enormous inequality gap that is putting at risk in the long term the peaceful continuity of evolution. I believe that today what we decide will have profound consequences in our future. And the issue is that, as Richard said, the rich have the power and the political control. That's true, that's part of the way we are. We don't know, and it doesn't appear to be, that they will have a survival wisdom as the European had after the Industrial Revolution. So we have to make noise and push for this wisdom. And that's mainly what we have written with Scott in our book, trying to propose and give ideas of how this global inequality should be dealt. And the first point is to go to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is that, as any other global matter, global inequality is a global challenge, like climate change, like international high-tech crimes, and many other global issues. They cannot be resolved with nation-state institutions. And that is obvious. Nation-state institutions defend their national interest. Diego talked about this regarding climate change. You cannot resolve climate change with a bunch of countries all trying to take the less possible burden of the problem. That cannot resolve a global problem. And you cannot discuss the problem also with current international institutions, because they are formed by nation states, which are always defending the national interest and trying not to take the burden of the problem. So that means that to resolve global challenges like global inequality, we need to create global institutions. And global institutions require global citizenship, because it cannot be formed by nation states. It needs global citizenship so you can have direct political decisions by the people without having them to elect representatives in each nation state, which will not resolve the global problem. And once you have these global institutions in place, which will require a lot of work, and in the book we propose many ideas of how to start smoothly constructing these institutions in parallel to existing ones, and very importantly, using the level of technology and artificial intelligence that we have today. The technology revolution has created enormous problems, but also can be a big part of the solution in the problem, because you couldn't construct global institutions in the past without the technology that we have today. If today smartphones can be handled to all persons in the world for commercial purpose, you could use that same possibility to construct in those smartphones global institutions where people all around the world can discuss issues, because with artificial intelligence, you don't have a language barrier today to have discussions between a Paraguayan and a Bangladesh guy. You can do that with technology today. And with those smartphones, you could have a global participation, a global debate, global information of those global challenges, and finally also global voting about decisions. Imagine having a platform of global decisions where you can show the world that 5,000 million people believe that more significant changes should be done by all countries to resolve the issue of climate change. That will be a message to nation states. But what I strongly believe about what should be done to attack global inequality requires, with global institutions in place, to attack for what for me is the main problem and the main solution for global inequality, that is the educational system. The educational system of today is working like a factory with two doors, where one door, that is the private school, enter all those wealthy students that go directly to the opportunity hall without even touching the rest. And the other door are public schools that all the less wealthy enter to look in a glass mirror, in a glass window, how the other students are standing in the opportunity hall. This is our educational system of today. And I believe that the solution, as the social welfare state was in Europe after the Industrial Revolution, the tool to attack and resolve global inequality is in the educational system. And the educational system is what it is today because of the use of neoliberalism tools in the educational system. The word liberty is used for the educational system to consolidate and aggravate inequality. And I'm not criticizing neoliberalism. I'm saying that the educational systems on a global scale today need of socialist tools, needs of a mix of people. You need to mix the university, the school and university students, imposing strong quotas in private schools and universities to allow the less wealthy to participate in the private system. And you need to mix also financial resources. You need to centralize financial resources towards the educational system to redirect those that go much more to the private system to the public, so you can leverage the academic standards of public and public schools. And with that done, I think it would be the best solution to combat inequality and produce people that will feel that they are all part of us and that nobody is left behind.
Just gracias, boludo. Thank you very much, Pablo. Well, a few things come up. It's really good that you mentioned the idea of global voting and the whole smartphone potential for as a tool to enable the population of the planet for the first time ever to participate in influencing decision making. And if our principle is that everyone everywhere is equal and everyone everywhere is entitled to participate within democratic life, let's use the tools that we have and try to begin thinking of ways by which that can be facilitated. There's no place on earth now where a majority of people don't have iPhones or smartphones or Samsungs or whatever. How do we go from that technological reality to enabling them to be direct participants? And it reminds me, let me make a plug for Australia. I told you earlier, we're in the middle of an election campaign. We have mandatory voting in Australia. You must vote. It's your legal duty. It's not your legal right. You're fined very heavily if you don't vote, and you're essentially automatically registered to vote from the age of 18 onwards. Every single election we have is on a weekend, so people can freely come and not have to take time off work. And this process has all sorts of benefits. Probably the most notable is that it forces the political outcome in the end. Oh, we also have preferential voting as well on top of it. So it's not a black and white system. It's you vote by preferences 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And those are added up and then added to the total. It almost guarantees a sort of centrist outcome in the end, slightly left or slightly right. And also allows the participation of, I think, currently more than 35 political parties. And you get a free sausage at every single voting station in the country. You can get a free sausage and a piece of white bread. And that doesn't taste so great, but it does facilitate people standing around. And the waiting time also is a matter of a few minutes. It's got all those features. So rest of the world, have a look, consider these as options, and know that voting systems can take many different forms. And then also, simply because you're in Uruguay at the moment, I presume, just to remind people that Uruguay is very unique country in many ways. And from, I think it was 1951 to 1958, Uruguay actually had a committee as a head of state. It was not an individual person. It was a rotating committee, much like Switzerland has today. So it shows that there are systems that can be tried. I mean, it only lasted 7 years, but nonetheless, it was tried to prevent the emergence of a dictator. That was the absolute rationale behind it. So once again, another way to start thinking about bigger issues, which segues perfectly into Torbjorn's talk next about not just the idea of a world parliament, but the idea of a world head of state. Because obviously, one of the major reasons that people oppose such potential outcomes is they're terrified of the emergence of a global emperor that someone in the world today may well be trying to become. And so it's a very real issue. And if there is going to be a head of state, if one is even needed, we certainly need to figure out ways by which any sort of potential tyranny can be prevented. And one last thing, I'm just reminded, if you go, Switzerland currently has a rotating presidential system. If you ask anybody on the street who's president today, a lot of people will not even be able to answer the question because it's rotating all the time and they don't really care that much. So that's another thing that we can shoot for. We need politicians not to be chosen for charisma, but chosen for competence. So thank you again, Pablo, very much. And now I'm very happy to give the floor to Torbjörn Tansjo from Sweden, who has done many things throughout his career in ethics and philosophy and politics, and including a book on the question of a global parliament or a world parliament and its potentials, its challenges, and how could we actually go from where we are today to that. So the question we asked Torbjörn was, how realistic is a world parliament? What are the key obstacles to a world government? So Torbjörn, you have the floor.
Thank you.
Since Gary
Davis was mentioned here, I should perhaps start by confessing that I am a citizen of the world. In the late 60s, I requested a passport from him and received one. But then I kind of forget about these questions until I entered a research project some 15, 20 years ago called Democracy Unbound. And then we return to the discussion about global democracy was really the main focus of this project. And some of us in the project became advocates of it. We had Bob Goodin, for example, who even argued that it was inevitable, but it was a bit chilling when he added that it might take hundreds of years to establish such an order. I was more eager to have some kind of result here. I will describe how I actually have changed my mind regarding what Richard Falk called the transition problem. But I start with Bandy Lee and her observation about the kind of suicidal, collective, extended suicidal predicament of humanity and human civilization that was and is still part of the point of departure for my thinking about this problem. I think that humanity and human civilization face global existential threats, really. I mean, it's obvious with the nuclear bombs. Say that this probability is 5% in each year that it will happen, an all-out nuclear war, because of accident or insanity or whatever you have as a possible cause for it. Then asymptotically you approach certainty that it will happen. And with 5% a year, within the next 10 years, it's more probable that it will happen, that it won't happen. But for some reason, we should be scared, and the scare would really foster a rational reaction to the nuclear threat. But it hasn't worked, really. I mean, and I think it's because it's invisible in a way. Once it happens, it's too late to do anything about it. Climate change, global heating is different. It happens on a timeline, and you can reach moments when you realize that it is like the aliens threatening us with extinction for us on the globe. So that is, I'm more hopeful that we will take action in reaction to global heating. And the combination of global heating and nuclear war, of course, is terrible as a possibility. And the hotter the climate gets, the more narrow the globe tends to become, and the more fierce the competition and military confrontation between nation states. Perhaps that's part of the explanation of the situation we are facing right now. So in the research project, I developed... And I also argued that because of the tragedy of the commons, we need a world state, and I suppose all in this discussion would agree about that. The problem is that people tend to say, it doesn't matter what I do, it makes no difference, no noticeable difference to my situation if I stop emitting greenhouse gases, for example. And it's the same political leaders tend to say. And the problem with this reaction is that it is correct. It's true. I mean, it makes no difference. And that has to do with the fact that we are split into sovereign nation states, where individually each one sees to his or her own best interests. And when they are successful in doing that, when they are rational in doing that, then we reach its suboptimal equilibrium where we might go under together. Now, in the good old days, when I entered this research project, then I advocated this simple transition model that we should, first of all, we should try to establish a parliamentary assembly within the UN structure, which is peaceable. There existed already then, and it still exists, an initiative to this effect, fairly successful in the sense that many parliamentarians sign petitions to this effect. And so we should build on that. And then the other idea was successive disarmament by states who felt reasonably secure in the world order in exchange for guarantees from the United Nations for their security. And those two ideas should work in tandem. The idea was, and this was a very rosy picture, you could say, perhaps naive, even already then. today I think it's obvious that it will not happen in this way. So I really changed my mind and become much more pessimistic in my assessment of our predicament now. So in fact, I mean, time will be up long before we have reached this goal, even if it doesn't take hundreds of years, that as Bob Gooden claimed, but we don't have another 100 years, or much less, I suppose, given the development of the climate crisis and the probability of a nuclear war. So now I'm ashamed to have to say this, and it's really terrible, but I now put my hope in some kind of coup where people situated strategically can coordinate their actions and establish the world state. So first, we must have a world state which we could democratize, and we could develop the kind of sense of belonging, and so that we think should go together with global citizenship. But we have to start, I think, in a way nation states have started. I mean, no nation states had been created in this piecemeal democratic manner that I envisage for the world state, and I think it won't happen even with the world state. So I'm still hope that it will have a democratic potential. So once it has been established, we can work in direction to establishing the global democracy, the truly global democracy that can handle all those existential problems that we are facing. So that I hope that, and if we first can establish this parliamentary assembly, it would be fine. Supporting this kind of global enlightened despotic government that could perhaps save us, but would also be vulnerable to democratic criticism and so on. One might also hope that those democracies that exist in the world today would still exist within this new political orders. They would be robbed of their sovereignty, of course, but they could still be democratic. But as you know, last year, 13% of the world population lived in well-functioning world liberal democracy. Now we're down to 12%. So I mean, the idea that first establish democracy, let alone socialism or something, and then solve those existential problems, I think that these are non-starters. So I now take up this pessimistic stance I mean, it is really truly optimistic, isn't it? Because it is the idea, at least, that someone will save us before it's too late. And still, I would be prepared to bet on that it will not happen. It's more likely that we will go under together than that we will find a way to save humanity, human civilization before that. So let me finish by my philosophy of hope, which should be added to this pessimistic picture. I think it's possible to be hopeful even if you're a pessimist. You could hope even for the impossible to happen. And it's also rational to work to establish something that is highly improbable if the stakes are high enough, because you have to multiply the low probabilities with the high values. So that renders it reasonable, individually reasonable, to do whatever you can to establish this kind of new world order. And when Greta Thunberg and others take to the streets, I bring my clarinet and I join them in those rallies in the hope that it will make a change for the better. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Torbjörn. Well, you know, I guess I partially agree and I partially disagree. You know, I mean, one has to be pragmatic, but one has to retain that sense of hope. And I think, again, as I've mentioned and others have mentioned throughout, we need to put ideas out there that people can latch on to. And so much of world citizenship and global governance and so on really seems like an esoteric, impossible dream. So people just give up immediately and walk away and work on their own self-interest. And, you know, so I think we need somehow, I don't know, there's no blueprint for this. There's no guaranteed answer of what will succeed. But I think if we start putting ideas out there that people can latch onto, it's going to increase the chances of it coming into being. So one of the ideas we were putting out there, in our book and elsewhere, is this idea of a new citizenship status called Jus Gaia. So instead of just soli or just sanguinis or just nexi, the next evolutionary stage is Jus Gaia. So you simply get citizenship from the day you're born. That is global citizenship, and then you convert pre-existing citizenships using the Jus Gaia legal notion into world citizenships, and quickly we all suddenly have the same citizenships. It's a little bit of esoteric pipe dream hopeful thinking, but nonetheless it's putting something there. And the same thing with dealing with the political predicament of the current day and the rather extremist non-cooperative actions which are emerging from the country of my birth, but not the country of my citizenship, as you can figure out from my accent. And it makes one think that if a country wants to focus exclusively on its own citizens and go entirely inward instead of being a part of the whole, then something needs to happen with the remaining 96% of humanity who doesn't live in that particular country, which maybe is the next step in our collective political evolution, which means maybe we need some sort of voluntary union of democratically inclined countries that can be the first stage in building a much larger supranational state, whichever form it may eventually take. And I mean, the European Union did it, Australia and New Zealand have done it. A range of other countries have formed into various very loose unions. So it's not at all beyond the realms of possibility. And as I keep saying, there's more and more people that I think see the benefits of cooperation and collaboration and our similarities rather than our differences. But we need to, really put concrete options out there and get people to start embracing them. And again, see the concrete difference it would make in their lives. Not being fearful of whatever, but showing people that their standard of living will go up, poverty levels will go down, violence will go down, domestic violence will go down, on and on and on. And if we can do that, maybe we'll make it, because we whatever words you want to use, we always describe it as a sort of battle between oneness on the one hand, the unity of humanity, etc., and noneness, our extinction, on the other. And it's a battle going up, and and noneness is winning. Noneness is winning. Oneness is not winning, but it's up to us and many, many, many others to try to get oneness back on top. And, I think, in the end, for whatever reason, how much luck we've had as the human race that nuclear weapons haven't used except for those 2 times in August 1945 is a little bit of a miracle. And we're extremely lucky. Only 9 states have them, 9 important states, but nonetheless, 184 states don't have them. And that's, the overwhelming majority. So there are, we have a world in which a tiny percentage of the human race or nation states control essentially all the rest. And when you put individual humans within those regimes who have amassed wealth that we can barely imagine, the billionaire class, the 2,800 billionaires, and they have political power as well as their economic power. We have a big dilemma, but we also have something then to struggle against. I mean, that 3 individual people in the United States, Bezos, Zuckerberg, and Musk, have more net worth between them than 180 million of the poorest Americans is just simply unfathomable. And how we can allow that to continue is, beyond belief. And if more and more people knew about that, and we started thinking about ideas that are coming out all around the world now about limitarianism, for instance, where there should be a maximum amount that any individual should be able to possess, and anything above that is taxed at 100%. It's a simple scenario. You can get rid of billionaires or ultra wealthy people by taxing them at 100% above a certain amount. That's all you need to do. It's as simple as that. Will we have the political will to achieve that? Will they allow that to occur? Remains another question. So thank you again, Torbjorn. Now we turn to Sir Reed Brody, who will be answering this question: how do we protect against the emergence of a global dictator in a world government elected by a world citizens? Now, Reid has been active in the human rights field for 40 to 50 years, starting in New York and then traversing the world. He's written an excellent book that I would recommend all of you to read called To Catch a Dictator by Columbia University Press. As I told you before, he's been nicknamed by people across the world as the dictator hunter, has spent the last 10 to 20 years really focusing, among other things, on holding dictators accountable for their various crimes, and not just in Chad, but in a range of other countries. He was involved in the Pinochet case. He's involved in various African cases now. He's on the United Nations Committee of Experts on Human Rights Violations in Nicaragua, which is, I don't think the actual name, but there is a committee of 3 people that he is a member of right now. He worked for Human Rights Watch for many, many years, and barely a day goes by that you won't see him on French television or Spanish television or international television or CNN or BBC or whatever. He's a very frequent commentator on all sorts of political developments, including those in the country where he lived for a long time in the United States. So, Reid, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Scott. Can everybody hear me? I'm not sure if this works. Yeah. And it's really great to be with you and to see Richard Falk again. I haven't seen him in many years, somebody I really admire a lot. I also, and this reminded me, I also once had that blue world passport. And the only time I tried to use it at Heathrow, I ended up getting put in a room with all of the other undesirables. So it's not something I have tried to do again. Obviously, I think we all agree that a world government would tackle the different crises that nation states struggle to address, things like climate change and economic inequality. But the question I've been asked is I think a real question, which is how do we design a world government that is resistant to tyranny? I think that it's pretty obvious, as Scott said, that the idea of a world leader is a very scary one. Centralized power without direct accountability has historically led to authoritarianism, and unlike national governments, a world government would be even further removed from the daily lives of citizens. And I think this is especially true now, with emerging technology, with artificial intelligence and big data and digital platforms. I mean, we've talked about how it could enhance democracy, but I worry that it could also enable control by a small number of people. So I think we need to think about what kind of structural safeguards could be put into place against a global dictatorship. And some people already today have talked about, and I know Scott's book is, or Scott and Pavlo's book is very, proposes a global parliament with representation and direct citizen participation. Obviously, things like a Bill of Rights, an independent judiciary. But I think that a lot of the lessons that can be taken from federalism. And Scott has mentioned, and other people have mentioned, the European Union. I've been living in Europe for a good part of my life. And I mean, that's obviously, the European Union was created first and foremost, or in large part, to bring France and Germany together, really, to promote peace in the part of the world actually where more wars have been conducted than anywhere else, where you have a more diverse population actually packed into a small place than anywhere else on the planet. But also, my feeling living in Europe, including living 7 years in Brussels, is that there's a real democratic deficit in the European Union, that people, citizens feel very alienated from Brussels. EU decisions seem very technocratic and opaque. Even I was for several years, I was Human Rights Watch's global spokesperson based in Brussels, and I never understood how the European mechanisms worked. And I think that's the case for a lot of people in Europe. And although I believe, and today in particular, that the European Union is one of the great achievements of our age, there is a lot of Euroscepticism. People around Europe feel that decisions made in Brussels that affect their lives directly are not decisions that they have control over. We look at other federal systems. The United States, has a strong federal system, although it's gotten more and more power to the central government. We have had a strong tradition of an independent judiciary. We have a strong constitutional Bill of Rights. But we're seeing today, we have a dictatorship in the United States. We have a dictatorship in the making in the United States. The founding fathers certainly, when they prepared the checks and balances of the American Constitution, they did not foresee the rise of political parties, and they assumed that when you had an executive who was going to an executive who tried to arrogate power, that a Congress jealous of its own prerogatives would stand up to the president. And we're seeing today that because you have one man in control of a party, which is in control of the two dangerous branches of government, that is not happening. We're seeing in the United States that the rise of social media and big tech has created polarization. It's created a lack of education, and I think for this group here, it's no surprise to hear somebody say that the United States is becoming an undemocratic country. So that kind of federalism is not working today. Scott mentioned, and I think somebody else mentioned, Switzerland, which I do think is certainly a country which has solved the dictator problem. You have power which is distributed among national, cantonal, municipal levels. You have a rotating presidency. As Scott mentioned, most people don't know who the president is. You have direct democracy via citizen referenda. You have Switzerland's essentially three separate countries brought together. And it can be slow and conservative, and it's hard to do things on an urgent basis. But it certainly deals with the question of having a dictator. But my fear is how somebody in Chile, how somebody in Japan, how somebody in the United States, how somebody in India is going to feel part of this world government, and how they're going to feel connected to decisions that are made so far away. And I think there are a number of countries, and I think of the electoral systems in for instance, Nigeria. in which one of the questions would be, how is that person chosen? How is the person who runs the executive going to be chosen? And I think actually the Switzerland model is not a bad model at all. I mean, you have one person. I mean, you could have one person in the executive or you could have one person from Africa, one person from Latin America, one person from Europe, one person from Asia. Not a bad idea. In a number of countries, and Nigeria is probably the best example, to win an election, you have to have a minimum percentage of votes from a diverse set of regions, not just a global majority. I think with 60% of the world's population is in Asia. Does that mean that you can have theoretically an elected leader who got no support from any of from the rest of the world? But I think, we have to look at all of these ways to build on a federal, I think on the idea of federalism. I think a democratic world government is possible, but there has to be some kind of shared sovereignty. There has to be checks and balances. There has to be some degree of direct democracy, but it needs to be also balanced by distributed support. The previous speakers have all been much more philosophical than I have, but I think obviously education is the key to an informed citizenry, and obviously we're going in the opposite direction. Barack Obama said, I think very correctly, that you cannot have democracy when we can't agree, when citizens of a country cannot agree on what is true and what is untrue. And I think we're going to have to tame somehow technology. We're going to have to tame artificial intelligence before we get there. But I think a democratic world is possible. I think the contours of it are easier to determine than what several people here have called the transitional problem. How do we get there? We can't even reform the Security Council that some people have talked about here. But I think if we're going to solve these problems, if we do believe that that a child in Gaza has the same inherent worth as somebody in New York, we need to have a world government. So, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Reed. It reminds me of another world passport story to go along with yours and Torbjorn's, where there was this what is he, a hip hop artist called Mos Def. He used his world passport trying to leave South Africa after a series of concerts there, and was promptly arrested and put in the slammer. And I think maybe he was deported, or maybe he was actually kept in prison for a while. But anyway, it was frowned upon by the authorities. And obviously that whole idea was a great idea in principle, but it never really panned out. But the whole idea, back to the idea of rotating leadership, it does come down to a degree upon, the criteria that are used to select leaders, and charisma and money tend to be the dominant forces these days. And building up a constituency of cronies and henchmen that allow you to take that position. And just as a reminder, remember the thing that every diplomat from Europe hates is when their country comes up for the rotating European Union presidency, which comes every 6-month period So, basically once every 12 and a half years or 13 years, you have to run the EU, even if you're small little Estonia, let alone big old Germany. So they've kind of dealt with this issue by having their own rotating system. So I think there is there are design options out there for trying to consider how to unequivocally prevent any sort of emergence of a global tyrant, because the danger of that obviously is too huge to even contemplate. But it raises the question: do we even need a global head of state in the end? Can we imagine a better future where such a thing is not even needed? Maybe we can. Maybe we can't. But one of the final things that you said about the child in Gaza and everyone else can really be applied to every single human alive. Do we as humans take the view that different humans have different values, or do we take the view that every single human is precious and irreplaceable and equal to ourselves, and the suffering they feel the same suffering that we would feel in similar circumstances? And that's what it ultimately, will come down to, whether it's Ukraine or South Sudan now, or the prisoners in the CCOT prison in El Salvador, or whatever, or the migrants that are plucked off the streets now in the United States and sent arbitrarily to other countries around the world. Are these fellow human beings, or are they somehow some category of creature that doesn't deserve the same rights that we do? And in the end, that's what it all comes down to, and we all know and hope that people will end up on the side of reason and decency. So thank you again, Reed. I think the final speaker tonight is Preeti Nalu, who is now the executive director of Report for the World. She's also a journalist and a writer and a film director. She's doing a really cool film for my other NGO, Displacement Solutions, right now, which we're launching in Bangkok at the end of May. And her question is, how can we use the mass media to promote the idea of world citizenship? So, Preeti ji, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Scott, for inviting me to this conversation. I'm obviously among a very privileged, it's a privilege to be among a very accomplished set of individuals. And we are all, in some sense, who are in this room, privileged, I suppose. And so if I can take the conversation in a different direction, the program that I'm working very much came out of this impersonal relationship that mass media tends to have with audiences, where you have a one-way conversation. These very intelligent investigative reports are put out, and they are not always relatable to the communities that are often at the heart of these conversations that we're having: climate impact, displacement, migration, socioeconomic divides. So Report for the World is very much about distilling these seemingly insurmountable, complex, interconnected crises to actionable insights, actionable levels of engagement from communities. So we're talking about global citizenship here, and I don't think that is possible without actually having a deep engagement with your own community. One of the side effects or the collateral damage of globalization has been that we know so much about the larger world, but we know so little about our direct community. I know, Scott, you're an exception to this. You're both a global citizen, but you also know exactly where your produce is grown, who's opening a local, enterprise, how you can be more engaged as a citizen that cares about climate. What are the initiatives and community action that's happening in your neighborhood? But that's sadly not the case for a majority of the world. So I think what journalism and what we support is very much public interest media. So it does tend to be small in size, but with focused audiences. At our program, we're supporting I think over 70 reporters at about 60 public interest media over 32 countries. And what we are able to do to create that feeling of interconnectedness or oneness or being a global citizen is connecting them across borders. So when you have local journalists working with nuance, with language, with context, who are intimately connected to their communities, liaise with other such reporters, then you create cross-border storytelling that can reach audiences and communities at multiple levels, at the most local level, at a regional level, and a global level. And I think that's where, when these happen in tandem, both the bottom up and top down, and we meet somewhere in between, that's where we can find the most practical solutions. And so the film that I'm working with you on is very much along those lines, right? Where we're looking at local activists who are from the communities feeling climate impact and are finding solutions within their community. So this particular film is about Sindhu, who is the daughter of a fisherman who's living in Kerala in this coastal village, and has connected with other such, children of fishermen who are directly impacted by soil, by coastal erosion, and are no longer able to find fish in the sea. So either they migrate, get displaced, or venture further out into more treacherous waters, losing their lives. So there is a direct impact there. So the sort of activism, the sort of storytelling and messaging that is going to come from the people who should be the heart and center, front and center of these conversations, is where I think we have a lot of gaps. And I think we can say that this happens in academia, this happens in journalism, this happens in many facets of the humanitarian sector. Again, I think it has at least a little to do with the neoliberal systems that are in place that a previous speaker mentioned, and rightly so. And so I think we have to deconstruct a lot of that. I'm just coming out of an international journalism festival, which happens in Italy every year, and we arranged a series of talks that looked at decentralizing media support for the global majority. So the terminology also needs to change. And we use global majority because today that could include the United States, because of how the situation is changing. And so that malleability, that flexibility needs to exist within our systems, because to be globally connected to the world, you need to be connected to your community and know where you can have the deepest or most direct impact. So that's what I think media can do better. And of course, cross-sector partnerships are so important. A lot of extremely valuable insights have been shared here. I don't think they always reach the mass media with as much context and understanding among journalists and among the audiences. So I think cross-sector partnerships are really important. More diverse distribution of our content, not thinking just investigative journalism or just, a traditional format of a report, but really repackaging that into something that is more relatable to somebody who's living in rural parts of India or Nigeria or Brazil. So how do we reach them? So it's a lot about how do we shape stories and narratives that actually serve the needs of our communities, and how do we make that participatory? Because civic engagement happens when people believe that their voice matters. It's about giving them a seat at the table and asking them, what else can we do? And so journalists tend to be very egotistical. We often ask, what did you like about the story? Wrong question. It should be about, why aren't you sending your child to school if you're an education reporter? What is the issue with water contamination in your community if you're looking at climate and health? So it's about reshaping our own attitudes and values. And I think I ask myself all the time, how is the representation in the room? That's a lot of what we talked about in Perugia. I'm not representative of India. I'm a sliver of the most, I come from privileged parts of India. So who should be telling the story? Are we giving them that voice and opportunity? Is there equity Is there gender representation, geographic representation, linguistic representation? So I think all of those are necessary within journalism and within, any of the mobilization that we want to have towards this global citizenship.
Right. Thank you very much. And it brings up the other big issue that, when's the last time you ever heard a major international media company talk about the question of world citizenship and all that it implies, and you have to think probably, many years ago, because it's just not there. And I think it's going to be up to local journalists and regional journalists to get that message out there in a way that resonates with, a larger audience, because unless it's there, that, people are so ingrained to see themselves as a national of a particular country because that's the system they were born into, right? Most people never even question it. I am, Nigerian through and through, and that's what I am, and I'm proud to be, and every other country is inferior to ours. And I could say India, I could say United States, I could say Brazil, whatever. And I think the role of journalists, particularly international ones, are to help to erode those notions and to show, again, the shared suffering that we all have and we all see across the world, and to make it our own. Because, people that think at all about what we're talking about here tonight, there's a joy in caring about all of humanity, but there's also a burden, And, I must admit, for me personally, there's many moments of my life when I wish I did not care because the pain and anguish is too huge to bear, and if I didn't have techniques to transcend it, it would be really, really hard. But I'd much rather care and feel the pain of caring than not care at all. And we still live in a world where clearly not enough people care about the value and worth of the fellow humans across planet Earth who are needlessly suffering, often victims of clear international crimes that will be gotten away with, And again, for journalists, we need them to expose those things and to be what they have traditionally been in many countries, is fearless. There's a reason that whatever the number is now, last year, 200, 300 journalists were killed doing their job. And many were arrested, many were detained, many were harassed. And that problem is not going away. And in fact, it's getting worse.
And if I may add really quickly, Scott, one of the ways of making them care, and this is the power of strong local journalism that connects to the global level, is finding solutions-focused journalism, constructive ideas. Not that we found a solution that works perfectly for every context, but linking those trends across geographies and saying, okay, what is missing in this scaling to size? Is it the attitude of the community? Is it someone not following the rules? Is it corruption? And then actually, sort of looking at how can we integrate this? How can we integrate climate consciousness into a community? It's about mainstreaming these ideas. It's about making people, without having to say this is a climate story, think about climate reflexively. And that comes through, again, locally driven solutions. And so this has to be done with equity, and the equity hasn't existed in journalism. There's been a lot of parachute reporting. I was a foreign correspondent at some point too. The idea being you go into a situation, you file a story, then you miss all of the trends that happen between the peaks of the news cycles. So these local journalists, researchers, storytellers, activists, they're the ones who are in the community, understanding with much more depth, okay, so this is what is happening on a much longer, longer time frame. So they're essential, and we have to work with them with equity.
It's absolutely right. Absolutely right. Thank you all very much for coming. I think it was really, really insightful and successful. And so, and what's the most common conclusion that people who have seen the world come to? It's that we are all the same. There are subtle, teeny differences, of course, and those are beautiful things in most cases. And the overwhelming majority of people you meet are kind and nice and friendly and open and willing to share their food with you and their homes and everything else. That is the majority of the human race. The majority of people are good people. The people who are bad, who will commit acts of violence, who are cruel, are very small in number. They may have disproportionate power, but they are not the majority. Caring, compassionate people are the clear majority, and we need to convert our world order, our system of global governance, into a system that recognizes that and acts upon that. And I can't imagine a better struggle to be engaged in than seeking to fulfill the promise of Socrates when he said, I am neither Athenian nor Greek. I am a citizen of the world. If he said it 2,000 years ago and we still haven't done it yet, we have some work to do, and we got to find ways to do it. And if we do it, I think I can imagine a happy planet for 1,000 or 5,000 or 100,000 more years with human beings on it who actually collaborate and cooperate and create what is completely within our means, a true paradise on earth. We have everything we need at our disposal. There's nothing lacking. We can do it, but we have to really make it happen. So thank you again, everybody. It's a great honor to be with all of you.